Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. And again, we have a fantastic guest tonight. In fact, she's a TikTok star. It's recorded that she has had 2 million hits on TikTok. If we get anywhere close to 1 million, we'd be more than gratified. So stick around and hear more from our guest later in the show. I just wanted to make my usual few comments on so-called current affairs and the fact that it's been a great day for British democracy. We've got a situation where there are people on the streets, people that the BBC are pleased to call protesters, but I suspect many of you in the audience tonight would probably call terrorists, i.e. they terrorise minorities. And I'm not sure that somebody who terrorises minorities qualifies for the title of protester. It seems to me that the people who laid down on the street as part of the Stop Oil programme and restricted traffic flow, but otherwise weren't harmful at all, got prison sentences of 5 years. And yet people who are looting shops and terrorising minorities, it looks as if they might get a few months in juvenile detention. I know that under the British democratic system, that's perfectly understandable, but it seems to me that most people would regard it as being grossly unfair. But to look under this banjaxed constitution that we experience on this island, to look for ethics and morality is probably a vain pursuit. But nonetheless, it seems to me these are sort of gross examples. I have to say that I think the media has not covered itself in glory when it comes to these outrages that we've been seeing over the last week or so. The fact of the matter is that if you use protester instead of terrorist, then effectively you're, as it were, glossing, i.e. putting a gloss over the activities of people who are behaving abominably. There's no way, for example, that an ex-First Minister of Scotland should feel it necessary to say that he and his family feel sufficiently threatened that they might consider leaving the country. I mean, that ought to make front page news all over the world, and certainly in the UK, and certainly without mistake in Scotland. Nonetheless, it hasn't. And that's what I mean by aiding the people who are breaking the law. If you only platform those who consider such law breaking as acceptable and deny coverage of those who find it utterly unacceptable because they feel threatened, then in fact you're condoning in the most gross way the behaviour of those who are terrorising minorities. And that seems to me to be wholly unacceptable. But then again, anyone looking at the front page of the Daily Mail over the last 2 or 3 years will see that there's a conflation between immigrant and Islamophobia, which seems to be regarded as being perfectly acceptable by major elements in the media. And I'm not sure that that's in any way acceptable. Part of the problem, of course, is that the Labour Party, in grubbing for votes at the last election, reached down for the dog whistle on immigration in order to try and convince people who were of that bent that they could safely vote Labour and still see a very firm, as it were, approach to immigration, whatever that may mean. And I think when you go down that route, you leave yourself terribly badly exposed when you want to try and modify the behaviour of those who feel that you have endorsed it. It leaves you on a very poor wicket indeed, it seems to me. And furthermore, it's noteworthy that John Swinney, the First Minister, went to a mosque and said there and then that this behaviour was unacceptable. It would have been fantastically gratifying to have seen Keir Starmer do likewise. but I don't think it probably crossed his mind for a second, assuming he's come back from holiday, of course. So there we are. That's a quick picture of the fact that it's not been a terribly great week for British democracy. Again, if that's not an oxymoron. So let's move on. We have a terrific guest tonight. As I said, she has over 2 million hits on TikTok, and hopefully she'll reveal why. She is a former MP and who lost her seat along with our guest last week, Martin Day, at the last general election. And we need to know, I suspect, how she feels about that and what her plans are for the future. So without any further ado, let me welcome Marion Fellows. Welcome, Marion. How are you?
I'm very well, John. Thank you for the big build-up. I think I may have disappointed a few folk when they discovered it was me. But I will reference that TikTok video. It was simply, it caught the imagination because I said the word arse, if I'm allowed to say it here, yes, in Parliament. And I did my wee act, the Daft Granny act, and tried to persuade the Deputy Speaker at the time that I should be allowed to say it, as did Stephen Kinnock, MP, son of the former Labour leader. And it seemed to catch people's imagination, the fact that I was able to stand up there as an old lady and say that bad word and argue and look a bit perplexed when I was being called up for using it, because it's a very strange place, the House of Commons. It's not somewhere that, I ever expected to be. Never expected to get elected. I'd stood quite a few times and never made it beyond, just increasing our share of the vote slightly. So when I got there, it was all brand new, like everyone else. I was one of the 56. We all had to find our own way of coping with the system. And I realised pretty quickly that there wasn't very much I could do to change that system. It's archaic. It's absolutely hidebound and symbolism and all the rest of it. But actually, there was no way I could change that. So what I had to do was to try and make it work for me and for the people I represented. And I think over 9 years, I eventually got the hang of it. And I'm really disappointed that I didn't get re-elected and get back down, because there was lots of things I still wanted to do and still want to do, even though I'm no longer a sitting member of the House of Commons.
Why is it, do you think, that it's so wedded to this rather nonsensical, very ceremonial approach to politics?
I think part of it is, and I love that, I got on really well with the House staff. So that's the clerks of the House, and people I got on best with were all the catering staff, to be fair, because I never cooked a thing all the time I lived in London. Perhaps for one night I made a meal, I think. It's just that it seems strange to us that they're so proud and delighted that they're part of the House of Commons team, that they want to preserve everything the way it used to be and the way they think it should be. And there had to be drag kicking and screaming. And I think that's why John Bercow was so unpopular, because he absolutely wanted to change how things were done. And Sir Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker again this term, is absolutely determined to make it all be the way it was when he was a boy. Yes. So we're back to wearing ceremonial robes and all of that nonsense that really isn't necessary in the 21st century.
I mean, it does, from the outside, look terribly odd. Because here you have an institution which desperately needs reform. Yeah. I mean, we have an upper chamber, so-called, which is full of people who had never been elected. Yeah. And a whole chunk of those folks are there because they're members of a political church. Yeah. And you think that this is very odd. It would be odd in the 20th century. It's even weirder in the 21st.
Yes and no. I might surprise you by saying that. I don't think the unelected House of Lords is a good idea, but there are lots of people who are in the House of Lords who are doing a good job and who this last term really held the government to account in a way that no other organisation could, simply because of where they were and who they were. There's lots of people in the Lords who are there, and it helps that they're not having to get re-elected. I'm not talking about superannuated Labour politicians who only turn up once every so often and actually speak, or the ones who travel down a lot, don't speak and just take the money and run. There's lots of them. But there are people like Tanny Gray-Thompson, who's done a lot, the former Paralympian, Floella Benjamin, who does a lot about on children's TV and talks now a lot about race. So there are people with good life experience who use that life experience, and for some of them who were former MPs, that have really helped people. I'm taking as an example someone I know very well, James Arbuthnot, Lord Arbuthnot of Edrom, I think his title is. And James Arbuthnot, if anyone watched Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, he was Joe's MP, and he really took it seriously and really, really fought for Joe Hamilton, and then now and has continued to fight for postmasters all the way for about 20 years. So that's really important. So we do need some kind of second chamber, and I absolutely. But at its worst, though, it is just a talking shop. And when you get folk like Baroness Moan, that just says it all, really.
That does say it all. I mean, I think a lot of people who study constitutions would find a second chamber entirely appropriate. I think it's the nature of the appointment to the second chamber that troubles a lot of people. The idea that Boris Johnson can place on these red benches a woman of tender years whose connection to him is perhaps, best to use the word, questionable.
Yes.
I think people look at that and think, well, this is just unacceptable.
It's absolutely nuts, and it shouldn't be allowed. And although they now they do House of Lords, Parliament, whatever, they say, oh yes, that's terribly, terribly bad form. We won't have that anymore. Let's have a committee to vet peerages and don't give it any power to actually do that.
Yeah.
So at the whim of the outgoing Prime Minister,
Yes.
Totally unsuitable people can then be in the second chamber. No. And I think as well, I've had some doubts recently, and I'm not absolutely clear in my own mind yet about whether the SNP, or the fact that we dislike the upper chamber and the fact that it's not democratic, all of the good reasons why, in the past we've always refused to take peerages. I'm beginning to wonder it might be better if there was at least one or two people in there that believed in Scottish independence. But now, I'm not proposing that. I would never take that motion to a conference. But I just sometimes think, because I'm very impressed, and I can't remember her name, one of the disadvantages of getting older is the young Plaid Cymru member of the House of Lords, who was actually elected by Plaid Cymru members to be. And I'm very impressed by her and what she is trying to do. And I'm wondering, going forward. But actually, I hope we're independent long before we need to think about that.
Absolutely. And if we do, and I hope we do have a second chamber after independence, and I hope it's organised in a way that people find acceptable right across the board. I mean, I can think of lots of people with fantastic experience who could bring enormous gifts to the legislative process, who are sitting on their hands because they just look at that process and think, that's not for me. I couldn't lift my head in my local community if I felt that some politicians had appointed me. I would rather be, dare I say, elected in some way, shape or form, so that I could point to the connection with the people who I'm ostensibly there to serve. But leaving that aside, you mentioned the post office there, Marion.
Yes.
You were deeply involved in the post office.
Yes, I was.
Tell us what you were doing and how you feel it's working out now.
Well, I got involved in post office issues because a local sub-postmaster came to me and said, the network's failing, I'm not making enough money, and it's really time somebody did something about it. So, because in deprived areas especially, and for those with disabilities, people who need a hand, really found the post office was their sanctuary almost.
Yeah.
Some postmasters would help them. They had a post office card account, so their benefit was paid in there, and they could always get help and advice, and they could go in and withdraw as little as £2, just to see them over to the next pension day. DWP wrote to everyone who was on benefits, and that, of course, I'm using the term benefits the way the UK government started to use it. That meant people on pensions, because according to them, pension was a benefit. I mean, I dispute that, and so do many others. But anyway, it was very useful. But what was happening is the government was giving money to post offices, and post office managers and post office executives were dreaming off that money and paying themselves large bonuses. And the postmasters in the front line were getting less and less. So I got involved in that side of it. And then when I joined the all-party parliamentary group, this issue, something called Horizon, sort of came into view for me. And I really started to pick up on this, and I'd actually been speaking to quite a number of postmasters locally. So I decided that when I was asked, because during COVID, the Labour chair of the all-party parliamentary group actually had to stand down because she was going on the front bench, and she said, Marion, you'll take it on, won't you? And everyone else took a step back. So I thought, right, okay. And my first meeting as chair, I said the reasons why I had taken it on was because I believed firmly that in an independent Scotland, we would need a post office network. Yes. It's one of these institutions, civic institutions, that if it wasn't there, you'd have to invent it.
I agree.
Now, what it's been doing now is slightly different, and it's changed quite a bit, but it's a really important for all sorts of communities, either urban or rural. It's really, okay, people don't go and buy stamps anymore, but they do still, and up till quite recently, we're doing things like passports, ID checks, all of that sort of thing. And the post office now is a franchise which isn't really working. And that's aside from the whole Horizon issue. And gradually over the piece, Horizon started to figure much more strongly. And because it's, APPGs have lords, peers, and members of parliament in them. And Post Office APPG had quite a few peers who used to attend quite regularly, and also a wide variety of MPs. I think almost every party in the House is represented. And actually, I once sent a letter on behalf of the all-party parliamentary group to the minister, and the Secretary of State in that case, and it was signed by, I think, every single party, including Sinn Féin, because it's so fundamental and so important. And the way that postmasters have been treated, and the way Horizon has been eventually now brought out into daylight, it's so important that we get to the bottom of this and actually recompense everyone. Now, there's lots of people who were charged and who were convicted of offences because of Horizon, but there are also many, many, many thousands more postmasters who were never convicted, but who on a weekly basis were paying in hundreds of pounds to their post office counter in order that they could actually open up the next morning.
Now, what's happened to all that money which the post office received illicitly?
Well, that's another issue, that there's no real, there is absolutely, we don't know, is the bottom line. And that could be another investigation, quite easily another investigation, because many of the bonuses that these people were giving themselves must have come from the money that was being paid in. And the number of times I questioned ministers in the commas, and I went through, I think there was about 10 postal affairs ministers in my time in Parliament. Actually, the one that sticks in my mind was Kelly Tolhurst, who told me there was absolutely nothing wrong because the post office was making a profit. And the whole idea of the post office.
So did slavery.
Exactly, John. So it seemed to me absolutely ridiculous. And to be fair, Paul Scully, who was the minister before Kevin Hollinrake, he got it. He did get it. He did move away. Kevin Hollinrake is still apparently raising the issue of post offices on a daily basis. And I think that I may have to go back to London. I want to go back and actually sit in on the inquiry, something I never had time to do before. And it's not quite the same. The only inquiry that I did go into see was the one they held in Glasgow right at the start when they were talking to sub-postmasters and how they were treated and what their experiences of the system were.
What was your, by the way, just incidentally, what was your estimation or opinion of the chief executive of the post office and the evidence that she gave?
Oh, Paula Verrills. Well, I'm always a fair-minded individual, and I actually fell out with Alan Bates when he came to an APPG meeting because he said, this woman has to be jailed, it's terrible. And, he was really adamant. And I said, well, I don't believe in witch hunts. And if she's done wrong, then of course she should be absolutely pay the price for that. But that wasn't really enough in those days for Alan Bates. And it was only when a number of postmasters, including Alan and Joe Hamilton, and also the then chair of Post Office Limited and the chief exec at that point, the new one, Nick Reid, came to a meeting of the select committee, that I thought, oh, Alan must have forgiven me, because he saw me coming along the corridor and he actually had said to a couple of people, oh, here's Marion. And I thought, well, I'm forgiven, because Alan Bates is a hero. Absolutely. He is someone I really, really admire. And what he has is persistence, stickability. And some of the other, Chris Head, one of the youngest sub-postmaster, Jo Hamilton herself, I got to know some of the Scottish folk who were also, and I actually had them down in Parliament the day that the exoneration bill was going to be passed, basically. And unfortunately, being the House of Commons, there were 3, I think, urgent questions or statements, and they had to get the train back before the bill actually reached the floor of the House. And I wanted them there in the gallery so that people could see, because in January this year, the Minister, Kevin Hollinrake, was talking about a UK-wide bill. And by April, it was suddenly, no, you jocks go off and do your own thing, because the law's too difficult, and we have to, and it was just complete. I think the technical term is mince. What they were saying was complete mince. And I'm pretty certain Alistair Jack was involved in a lot of the backroom dealings, abetted by folk in the Lib Dems as well, who just wanted to show that, Scotland is different, but in a bad way. Yes. So the Scottish Parliament did put a bill through at the same time, but it did create strange bedfellows, because I worked closely with the DUP at this point. And again, it's back to my original thought about Parliament. You have to work with other people. You might not like the politics, but you have to work with them sometimes to effect change. And that was how I did it. That's how I managed to survive, and how I could sleep at night, because I was doing the very best for the folk that had elected me, and for folk like sub-postmasters and folk with disabilities. I would work with anyone to further that aim,
And now, I mean, having put that so eloquently, what does that mean for you now? Because you're no longer in that sort of central position. I mean, what are your plans personally and politically?
Yeah, I think it was very strange for me to get elected. I never really expected to get elected. And it took me quite a while to realise how singular you are as an MP. You're one of only 650 people in the entire world in that position. And you really, I think you really have to use that for the best you can do for everyone, basically. I'm not a saint. Can I make that quite clear? But, it's an opportunity to have influence. As my eldest kept telling me, Mum, you have absolutely no power, but you do have influence. So I was able to do things to raise awareness of various things. And I think I'm finding, I had an email today from a large charity, thanking me for some of the stuff I'd done. And that's not, and I still want to carry on doing that. I'm trying to find a way of doing that. But I think at the moment I'm having a rest, simply because there was the election and I've been up and down like a fiddler's elbow. I think it's the best description of how I've been. Some days I'm okay, other days I am devastated for my staff, and a lot of folk don't realise that when an MP isn't re-elected, the staff lose their jobs. All the staff that they have lose their jobs.
And many of your people lost their jobs.
I had 6 people working for me, not all full-time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's huge. Every interview, you interview prospective staff and you tell them, I can't offer you security or can't offer you, lifetime job or anything. Mm. But, if I'm not re-elected, you lose your job. And everybody understands that. And we all understand it until that's in theory. When the reality hits, it is entirely different. You realise that, so for some people, paying their mortgage will be a struggle, all of that. And it's a huge responsibility.
Speaking personally, it was always one of the biggest challenges of my business life, was to say to people, we have to let you go.
Yeah.
And I was never any damn good at it, frankly. I thought I was, but you have to be in the receiving end. It's true that some people can take that on the chin, but I expect that they're not in the majority. I remember watching a television show called Moneyball, a movie or other with Brad Pitt, in which he was the manager of a baseball team, and he has this assistant, and he says, "Go next door and fire Bill Bloggs." And the kid said, "Sorry, what do you mean fire him?" "Well, just tell him." And he says, "I can't do that." "Yeah, why not?" He said, "Well, I just can't. He's got a family. His kids are at school here. What am I supposed to do?" He said, "Go next door and fire him, just like I just told you." And he says, "He's a pro, he'll know."
It's really difficult. And in spite of knowing, we knew early on in the evening that of the count that, we'd lost. And staff were there working away still, doing various tasks, knowing that they didn't have a job. And there was nothing I could do or say to make that better. And I've done 6 redundancy meetings. Yeah. And even though it's not pulling someone in an unexpected conversation, it is still hard. And it's still difficult to do. And my staff were great to me. Can I put it like that? Because I did feel responsible, even though it wasn't technically my fault. And I can't blame the electorate either. People vote how they choose, and that's
in fairness, that's generally the case in business. The board decide that they're going to change direction. You as a manager are not consulted as deeply as you perhaps wish, but you are required nonetheless to carry out the project and carry out the decision, and it's very difficult. Because you're invariably asked the question, "Do you agree with this?" The answer is, "No, I don't." But you have to say, "Yes, we have to do it." So you have to get on and get it done. Some people are blasé and can cope perfectly well. Other people are not. And
Yeah.
I think it's a part of being a human being that you're not. And I think if you ever come blasé about giving people very bad news, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing in terms of character development. But I know lots of people did and didn't turn a hair.
Yeah.
But I wasn't one of them.
No. I mean, I found that hard. I found it really hard, and that's just the fact that, and as you say, it's the human thing. You know these people. I've worked with some of them for about 7 years. Others were fairly new. It doesn't matter. They all put their heart and soul into doing the job that I asked them to do.
What you said you got perhaps a signal early on that things were not going the way you would wish at the count, for example.
Yeah.
Looking back now, because it's always great to look back because it's 2020 hindsight, and you feel much more secure about how things worked out. But what is your overall view of what happened in your constituency and how it may have been reflected across the country or not?
I suppose I was a bit blind, and I was blindsided. I was convinced that the election would come in October, and I was going to spend recess, summer, 6 weeks, chapping doors, doing all that I could to make sure that, things went ahead. I had got myself involved in quite a few campaigns in Westminster. I mean, okay, the post office, there were still lots of questions to ask, and there were still things to be done. So there was that, a number of disabilities things. And also I was working on a social energy tariff campaign that was really, really close to my heart. So I suppose I wasn't doing as much door knocking here as I could have done. And then it was really, when I spoke to people, I realized there was a dip. I realized that, yes, I thought, well, a majority is about 6-4. We could get in. We've got a fight in our hands, but and of course, there's always the bit. And being a politician, you have to have this almost. You have to believe in yourself. Can I put it like that? So you think, well, everybody loves me, so they'll vote for me. Never mind the party emblem, and even though that's proved to be the wrong way, and there are a few votes in being the incumbent, and there are a few votes in the folk that you've helped over the years, and that's fine. But actually, it was much deeper and wider than that, and we couldn't run the kind of campaign that Labour ran. For a start, we didn't have that kind of money. I got about 4 or 5 letters from Keir Starmer and various sidekicks, Anas Sarwar, Rachel Reeves, occasionally some from Pamela Nash, who is now the MP for the new constituency. All of that. But we couldn't really compete with that because that takes huge amounts of money, organisation. And I think we were all caught a bit flat-footed with the election being called as quickly. And although we rallied round and did get stuff out, it was always an uphill struggle.
Yeah, I mean, these are costly things, and I'm pretty confident that the Labour Party had deep pockets because I've watched the amount of money from various, dare I say, questionable sources that flooded into their coffers. So they were well positioned, and I suspect they got an early signal from their friends in the media that the Tories planned to cut and run. I have to say, I thought the decision that the Tories took was lamentable, but then again, you get used to seeing really odd decisions from people who really don't know what they're doing terribly well. But how much of the outcome would you put down to the SNP vote, if I can use that term, staying at home? And how much of it was down to the fact that Labour spent all this money?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both, and I have to be honest here. I haven't yet wanted to sit down and analyse the result in the way that I should and probably will. I've been, I don't know what the word is, I've been a bit lost and a bit tired. And it's a bit like running a marathon. When you stop, everything comes and hits you in the back. And I've been taking time away, and I've been looking after grandchildren, and I've been, trying to wind up the office here, and I've been down to Westminster to get rid of all the stuff in my flat. So I haven't really done that, but it seems to me that the indications are that our vote stayed at home. A lot of our supporters stayed at home. And also we have to really engage again with people over the period, because 14 years in government is a long time, and you're never going to get anything right. And let's not shy away from Operation Branch Form. Let's not shy away from things that have happened in the Scottish Parliament, where, my kids were watching football on this, and there was this huge bill. Now, I have great sympathy for him. I do, and Michael Matheson's a good man. I don't think he was being deliberately obtuse or trying to cover up. But he should just have come right out at the start and said it like it was once he discovered about it. So I understand it's very difficult when you're a politician and your family are what keep you sane, and you really try to keep them out of it as much as you can, because they didn't stand for election. They get a lot of feedback that isn't nice, and they see their loved one, if you like, being castigated, and it's hard.
It really is.
But it happened, and it should. And then we had a change of First Minister, the Greens and everything. And of course, the Labour story of the NHS being in tatters, and that was getting spread about all over, even though the NHS in Scotland was actually performing better, excuse me, even than the one that was run in Wales by Labour. So all of that built up this story.
Don't you think, though, that there was also an element of we have to get rid of the Tories?
Yes.
That's the top priority. Everything else is secondary to that. And people looked at it and saw that it was a Westminster election. If they didn't get rid of the Tories, then there'd be another 5 years of debauchery and malfeasance. And therefore, they felt they just couldn't stand that.
Yeah.
The fact that the SNP was perhaps a better opposition than the Labour Party, I think, was overlooked.
The broad message on all the media was get rid of the Tories, get rid of the Tories, get rid of the Tories. But for many areas in Scotland, that really the Tories were nowhere. The Tories were never going to win. So,
I think if you're sufficiently, most people are not plugged into politics. That's the case. They are driven to a large degree when it comes to elections by emotion.
Yeah.
And I think, frankly, in the past, the SNP has benefited in several respects because people felt patriotic, and therefore, even though they might not understand what the SNP was fully about, they felt it was hugely important to register that. And also, the first past the post system was hugely advantageous in past elections for the SNP.
Yeah, and
this time around, it was not, and the Labour proportion of the vote was 36%, and SNP was 30%. That's interesting, bearing in mind that the Labour Party is a huge majority across the whole island, based on 30%.
It's incredible when you think that in 2017 Labour got more votes.
Yeah.
And they couldn't wait to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn because it was the worst election result they'd ever had. Whereas this time, 36%, they've won so many more seats. They've got so many MPs, they don't know what to do with them. And that could actually come back to haunt them, because there's going to be a lot of folks sitting on the back benches with nothing much to do. And that's always dangerous for a political party.
Well, particularly the Labour Party. Who don't need to go looking for a fight amongst themselves. They can usually fall on each other's shoulders and necks with half a piece of temptation. My impression, and it's a somewhat lay view, this I spoke to a lot of people who looked at the SNP at Westminster and actually wondered what the heck you were doing there, because they were looking at a situation where they felt independence was terribly, terribly important to them.
Yeah.
And they didn't feel, either at Westminster or, dare I say, at Holyrood, that that particular element was being pursued in the way that they would have hoped it might be pursued, i.e. they looked at a lot of attention given to various gender issues and perhaps thought, well, hold on a second, this is important, but is it as important as independence? For them, it wasn't. And they didn't understand the rationale that they were presented with.
And the party lost a lot of people over that. And interestingly, a lot of people who left, and folk left my branch as well, a lot of them were older women.
Yeah.
Who tend to be the unsung backbone of any political party. And that was really, really sad. I mean, I don't think anyone, I personally have never put a label on anyone and said, because you are such and such, I don't like you, I'm going to nothing to help you, you're abominable. And I loathe and despise that kind of politics. Dog whistle stuff, and we're seeing it, the results of that just now. It's appalling. But you're absolutely right, John. I think we took our eye off the ball in terms of independence, and it became sidetracked. And I think also there was this whole thing on youth. Now, I'm going to say that, aren't I? I mean, being an old woman. But where it's all about influencers, and it's all about Twitter or X, and it's all about all the stuff that young folk use, Snapchat and TikTok and all of that. And, that's fine. That's absolutely fine, but it's not real. Real people, the people who actually turn out to vote, aren't on social media particularly, maybe on Facebook, but that's to keep in touch with family and friends. They're not interested in it for politics or even news gathering. And that had a huge influence as well. And I think absolutely I would fight to the death for votes at 16. I think the sooner we get young people involved in politics and get them into the habit of voting, the better, because then it becomes a habit. But there was far too much emphasis, I think, put on that. And I think if you take, for example, the GRA, it was allowed to become a huge divisive issue when most folk didn't even understand what it was about. And I think, to be fair, in Scotland, it's taken us a while to get there, that people now genuinely think, well, as long as you're not interfering with my daily existence, there's nothing strange now about gay marriage. There's nothing, all the kinds of things that 20, 30 years ago were absolutely frowned on. None of that matters now because people just accept it. The same could happen. And people would accept trans people because they didn't know. But it became much more than that. And it became two-armed camps who did not listen to each other. And that's the really sad thing. And how it was allowed to get to that. The first time I was called a TERF, I had to go and look it up because I had no idea what that was. Yeah, no, I really genuinely didn't. And I found it really I had questions. I wondered what was it all about. I tried to listen, but there was no real way to listen. There was a lot of, what is it they call it? They throw it out of aeroplanes to confuse the radar, chaff, isn't it? Chaff. Yeah. There was a load of chaff around it, and it just was allowed to take on a life of its own. I don't know how I would have voted if I'd been an MSP. I still don't know. I know that I don't want people to suffer because of who they are, But I
Yeah,
also know,
absolutely. I mean, it seemed to me it became less and less about the issue and more about how particular individuals felt strongly
yes,
about the issue.
yes,
And I
yeah,
think it leaves a sense in people's thoughts that the SNP had gone down a blind alley. Now,
uh,
whether they were forced down that alley or whether they ran down that alley of their own volition, it doesn't really matter. The fact of the matter is that's a view that a lot of people took,
yeah.
and they were disappointed and eventually upset because they felt that somebody somewhere should explain why it was necessary to go down this blind alley, and they never got an explanation from anyone.
And I think we, as a party, stopped listening to people. We were right. The parties got it right. This is what we have to do. But that might just have been a smaller part of the SNP. I think and the general public had no idea what was going on. And really, it wasn't first and front and foremost in what they cared about the cost of electricity, the cost of living, getting a job, looking after their families. And I think we stopped telling people what the SNP government has done over the last 14 years.
Yeah, I found that.
Yes.
I found that most people did not know. They did not know that the Scottish government spent hundreds of millions to mitigate the bedroom tax.
Yeah.
They didn't know. I mean, that's a failure of communication, and that's not to be laid at the foot of the electorate.
No.
That's when a party cannot get a simple message across. They need to take a long, hard look at the inadequacies that uncovers and deal with it. So let's take a look at the future because
Yeah.
we've looked back now. Let's look to the future. A lot of people who come on the show say we'd like to see a constitutional convention where all the sort of independence groups get together and forge some common way forward that it's demonstrably helpful to the people who make the final choice, i.e., the electors.
Yeah.
What's your view on a constitutional convention?
I think that's a really, really good idea. I'm speaking personally. I'm not speaking on behalf of the SNP here. I think talking and getting things out in the open and cooperation is how I've run my political life for the last 9 years, and I think I'd like to carry on with that going forward. The SNP is the largest party that supports independence. That's a fact. And without the SNP being involved in these conversations,
Yeah.
is going to mean that anything to do with the Constitution is not going to be worth talking about unless we're involved. I think there's been too many divisions and between independence groups. One of the joys, and those of us who really work, and that's how I ended up being the MP for Motherwell and Wishaw. I got involved in the referendum. My late husband and I got involved. We worked hard up to and including referendum day, and we went away broken-hearted a week later on holiday, and then suddenly noticed that the SNP had. I went away from Wishaw with 120 members. I was the membership secretary. By the time I came back after a week away, I had about 800 members. It was nuts. And I think the party was overwhelmed and never really recovered from the mass membership era. And because we were back to, I suppose, almost one person or two people running the party, and because we were on the up, it didn't matter. And it's only now there have been all sorts of issues. And
So do you think a constitutional convention would address those things?
well, I think a constitutional convention could actually lay down what we all know what we want. But it's how we get there. Now, I know, and people have told me that you shouldn't have MPs at Westminster. Well, I disagree with that, not just because I was one, but because there's a job of work to be done. And I know people who would be in a lot worse state now if their MP hadn't been able to go and sort something out directly. There's also the question of how do we get there? We now know the answer is nobody's going to hand it to us on a plate. Is it enough? Is it enough to win a majority again in the Scottish Parliament? What is the strategy for getting us independence and getting us a recognisable form that will be understood across Europe, across the world? I've heard.
Other people have said exactly what you said on the show. So I think, if you were a member of the Constitutional Convention or a supporter, I think you'll find that you'd be exceptionally welcome, because that's I think it's a general view, and it's a growing view that this is a smart thing to do. I think people are definitely interested in the best way forward. The reason that people, I think, are confused about the role of the party at Westminster is they look at MSPs and they say, well, that's their job to look after the drains and all the rest of it. So perhaps the people at Westminster ought to be concentrating largely on constitutional issues, i.e. how we intend to rid ourselves of this burden that we've got. And since that's essentially what the SNP is about, is creating a separate state. What they don't see is how the work going on to achieve that. I'll give you an example. I interviewed Stephen Flynn on the show some months ago, and I asked him a simple question, which was, who in the SNP, because it's party policy, is responsible for the Constitutional Convention? He said, I don't know, but I'll get back to you. I'm still waiting.
Yeah.
And I think that should never happen. If it was truly important, he would have known, and it would have been unnecessary. And I would have been able to talk to that person and find out what plans the party has for the convention, and when it was going to take place, and how it was going to take place, and the SNP's part in it.
Yeah.
These are all unanswered. These are simple things. This is not rocket science.
No, and you're right. I mean, there were members who were dealing with constitutional issues, but in the sense that they were replying and asking questions of ministers in the UK government who were responsible for the constitution. So at some point that was some really iffy characters, but that's right. And you're absolutely right. And I suppose we are to blame as MPs in some regards on that. But I have to tell you that the majority, I know my colleagues cared about independence, and that's why they were there, and that's why they wanted. But I think the party itself got into a bit of a morass once Alex Salmond resigned because he lost the referendum, if you like. Nicola Sturgeon resigned, and it's still a bit unclear as to why. I mean, I think if she'd stood down after COVID, I think people would have understood, because she did a terrific job during COVID.
I agree.
And she must have been totally wrung out, because I know most of us felt bad after it. And she'd done a sterling job, her and Jean Freeman, and the government did a really good job.
Yeah.
The fact that she just suddenly announced that she was going led to all sorts of suspicions, aided and abetted by Operation Branchform. We're still waiting for, only one person has actually been charged, and we're still waiting. It's like waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Yeah, but you see, this strikes me as a very interesting, but a very oddly reactive attitude to take. It seems to me you don't wait for the other guy to drop their guard. You go toe to toe. I mean, if you look at the successful independence movements across the world over the last 300 years, they were assertive, and some of them were hugely assertive. I mean, the Americans started off saying, well, maybe we can find a halfway house. But they contrived a set of circumstances where they the governing entity misstepped. And I think that has to be part and parcel of what one does. Because if one sits back and hopes that the other person is going to be, let's say, accepting, then that could last forever.
But what we need to do as a party, and not just the SNP, but anyone who believes in independence, what we have to do is convince those who are not yet convinced. And we can only do that by persuasion and by talking to people. And there's far too much introspection. I can't remember who it was, but it's the old thing. If one person had converted a no voter into yes, then the people would be prepared to go out and on the streets. I'm not talking about violence here, but just to show how important independence is to them. And that would make the difference. But at the moment, it's still eeksy-peeksy. And I think we do need to get polls to change. Yeah. And we need to do that by good governance and by making the strong case for why independence will make things better for people in Scotland.
I think the difficulty there, in part, is that runs against the media current.
Yes.
I mean, there's only one independent supporting publication in the whole of Scotland, which is scandalous. But that's because the main broadcasters report through a structure based in London,
yeah,
which on the face of it is perfectly acceptable, except it doesn't reflect the needs of their viewers.
Yeah.
And that's confirmed by not just opinion polls, but the fact that they have to lay off huge numbers of people. In other words, if you're not appealing to your customers, then of course your customers don't buy your product. And if they don't buy your product, you have to start laying people off. This is not rocket science.
No.
So we've got a media which is driven by goals which are developed somewhere else.
Yeah.
And that's unsustainable. And you would think that with all these MPs and control of the Scottish Parliament, that the SNP might have done something more assertive than it's done to date, and simply accepting that media environment without question. And I think that disappoints a lot of people because they think ought to have been done and challenges ought to have been made.
I think so. Now you have the perfect example today of Ofcom agreeing that BBC Scotland should halve its news content. Not that many folk who believe in independence watch the BBC for news, but to allow them to cut half of their news content for Scotland is not actually going to make it any better. And that part of the reason for that, of course, is that it's not devolved. Broadcasting isn't devolved. Therefore,
I think that's where the lack of assertion.
Yes,
is so evident.
Well,
I mean,
John,
I think if you run things, you ought to be on the front foot and saying this is unacceptable, and we're not having it. And you put in circumstances and arrangements that allow you to deal with that. And I don't see any evidence of that. What I hear are people saying, "I wish you wouldn't do that."
Yeah.
But if somebody's bullying you, it's not enough to say, "I wish you wouldn't do that." You have to actually do something assertive so that they know that's unacceptable. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. And I'd like you, and as many other people had, to actually tell me what that would be.
Well, I think that's the reason one of the reasons for a constitutional convention.
Yes.
Is if the mass of the people, the majority of the people say this is unacceptable, then it's unacceptable.
Yes.
And you don't have to put up with it.
And that is the answer. Change people's minds, get the mass of people on board for independence, and then we move forward. But it's not enough to keep saying that one party, the biggest party, is not doing enough. Everyone has to play a part.
I agree with that totally. Actually, Marion, we've run out of time.
Oh, gosh, and you did warn me, John, that this might happen.
I did say it would go fast. I didn't realise it would go quite so fast. Anyway, There we are. Thank you very much indeed. Do stick around if you've got a couple of seconds after the show, after we go offline. A big thank you to everyone watching tonight, and a particularly big thank you to Marion for being such an excellent guest. We've covered a lot of ground, and I suspect we could have gone on for another hour and still had lots to talk about. But there you are. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Again, my apologies if we didn't get through all of your questions. We tried to encompass in the general content as much as we could. We're looking forward to all joining us next week, where we'll have another exciting guest. In the meantime, take care, look after each other, and we'll see you all on Wednesday at 7 p.m. next week. Good night, all.